Starting off our binding, we are going to take our binding pieces and press them in half, wrong sides together, vertically. When you press, it's important to pick your iron up, not push and pull across your binding. Pick it up along each section and set it down. This will keep your binding from stretching out. I'm going to open it up and then press the bottom raw edge into that center crease we just made. Again, picking up our iron and not pushing and pulling, and then we're going to repeat on the top so that both are meeting this center crease. One more fold, just like we did at the very beginning. Now all the raw edges should be hidden, and we're going to give it another press. And grab our shorts here. And we need to make sure that we have the marking on the back piece where our binding stops. If you forgot to mark that, you're going to have to go back to your pattern piece, do a little quick mark. I did a notch, but you can mark it with a pen or any other marking tool that you like, tailor's chalk. With the right side of our binding to the wrong side of the shorts, we're going to pin at the top waist of the front piece. And then making sure our binding isn't twisted at all, we're going to do the other side over here on this marking. Now what we're going to do is pin all along the binding. Along the curves, what you want is the seam line, which is the first crease, to be 1 to 1 with your shorts. That means along the outer edge, it's going to very slightly stretch so that that inner line, the crease, is perfectly 1 to 1 with your shorts. If you stretch it, what it's going to do is going to make the curve curl in, and if you ease it, it's going to make it kind of flip out. So it's a fine line between the perfect amount. Along these straight edges, it's a little bit easier. You're just going to very, very slightly stretch. If your fabric is super stretchy, it's probably going to feel like you are not stretching at all. If your fabric is super tight without much stretch, you'll probably feel the stretch a lot more. The binding piece is barely smaller than the shorts. That's because this binding isn't meant to bring it in like a neckline. It's not very curvy like a neckline, so you're barely gonna feel that it's smaller at all. That's okay. We don't want to make this shorts line kind of curve in towards our body. We just want to finish it off with the cute finishing method. In the end, when you stitch your binding on, your pieces should really lay exactly the same as they did before the binding. So they shouldn't gather up and curl in, and they shouldn't wave out and kind of stick out. Now that we're all pinned up, we're going to stitch right along this first crease. I'm doing the thicker binding here. If you're doing the thinner binding, it's the exact same. Your binding piece will just be thinner. Okay, we're going to flip our shorts right side out. I'm going to trim off my notch that I used for marking. And then we are going to press this seam and our first seam allowance away from the shorts. Just like this. You don't want to unpress any of those creases in the binding, but you also do not want to skip this step. If you skip this step and your main shorts fabric has stretched out at all, your ending binding is going to be wavy and stretched out, and you're not going to be very happy. So don't skip any of these pressing. Binding is all about pressing, okay? So now we're going to fold our binding back along these creases, and once again I'm going to highly recommend you give it another press, especially along these curves. If you give it a press, it's going to make top stitching it much easier. You might not want to spend the time pressing, but I promise you it's going to save you time pinning and top stitching if you just give it a quick repress. Now that we're all pressed up, I'm going to grab some pins, and I'm just going to make sure that this first stitch line is just covered with my inner fold on the binding. Then I'm going to pin in place. Again, here is my stitch line. I'm just going to make sure that binding just covers that inner stitch line. There it is on the back. I do recommend as well not going from this side and working your way all the way down. Stop after a couple pins, go to the center inseam, go to the other side, and then work your way radiating out from these kind of 3 points, meeting eventually until they're all pinned together. This helps not stretch or ease your binding at all. It's very easy to do, especially if your fabric has a lot of stretch or movement. Maybe you're using something with like some rayon, modal, bamboo. Those tend to want to move around quite a lot. Or maybe a high stretch rib knit. It's so easy to slightly stretch that when you don't even notice. So don't start on one end and then go directly all the way across. Move around to the inseam, the other side, and then pin between. Now we're going to top stitch along this inner corner using your favorite stretch stitch. I used a narrow cover stitch here. You can use a narrow double needle if you don't have a cover stitch and you want the same look. You can also use whatever stretch stitch you like. Now we're going to do the side seams. I'm going to have this back piece. And what we're going to do is overlap the front 1/2 inch at the top. And we're going to pin on the unsewn side. And then you are going to completely cover these raw edges and pin in place down here, and then pin in between. Like this. I'm going to top stitch again along this side, and I like to follow this curve just a little bit to this side. You can top stitch on this side. It's got a teeny tiny little corner you can kind of tack down right there. It is optional. You can just trim off that little corner if you don't want to top stitch on that side. It's perfectly fine either way, just whichever you prefer. Again, I'm going to use my cover stitch, but you can use any stretch stitch that you like. So I tacked this side just to show you what that would look like. It's just this teeny tiny little corner right here. If you do not tack it down, you can just trim it off along with the rest of the seam allowance right here. I like to trim the seam allowance. It's not necessary really, but I also don't like it kind of curling up and getting in the way. So I like to trim off that seam allowance right there. And now we're finished with the binding on one leg of the Chrissy set shorts. And I hope you're ready to take on the other leg.